This, however, for Luhmann, the nation state was, and it could only be temporary. It could only be temporary because from the very beginning of modernity, each functional system is, well, is in a way meant or is going to go global. There is no reason, I will take the science for example, there is no reason why science should constrain itself within a certain territory, right? It might have been the case, that, well, partly that scientists were mostly talking among themselves in a nation and occasionally paying a visit abroad. You know? But of course, this is less and less the case. Right? If you think of the economy, that's also obvious. You might have had mostly one national economy with national currency, but from the very beginning and even before, it crossed the borders. Right? It went global. And for Luhmann, every functional system, including education policy, there is no reason why this conversation, a functional system is a conversation, right? It can be an economic conversation, right? But conversation about education. Right? There is no reason why this conversation should remain strictly within the nation state. So the nation state could only be temporary. And very soon it lost control, if it ever had control, but it lost control over the economy, that's I think very obvious, but over all other functional systems as well. Right? They became global. Including politics and law, right? Not just science, economy, art, education, but even laws are more and more a matter of global agreements and policy as well. So when we think, you see that this is a theory of globalization. Right? It's a theory of globalization, but it's a theory of globalization where when you speak, you have to speak about the globalization of education, the globalization of art, the globalization of science, the globalization of whatever else. Right? It's not globalization in general. Globalization can only work because it's an outcome of functional differentiation. So in other words, globalization is an outcome of that started with the very beginning of modernity. The tipping point, the tipping point where things become different. The tipping point was in the 17th, 18th century. The tipping point towards globalization today. Right? So, in other words, for Luhmann, we are still today in modernity. We are not in the next society. We are in a radicalized version of modernity. We are not in post-modernity, we are a radical modernity, or second modernity. Yeah. I spoke about the globalization of functional system. What is happening with functional system is not just that they become global. They also have a tendency to expand, the expansion of functional system. And I will try to explain what this means. I will again start with the economy as one functional system. I think it is very obvious, and you will read it everywhere. We speak of marketization of everything, right? We speak of the market being everywhere. It is obvious that the economy is expanding. I mean, I'm not giving you big news. What does it mean? It means that it is, as a system, it is picking more and more and more elements of its environment, to speak with Luhmann, and making them products or services. So turning them into economic goods. More and more stuff become a product. You can, I think, buy almost friendship now, or a coach. No, yeah. You go in a plane. I think this is new. You can now. You can buy. That's for a long time. You can buy the fast lane to go faster. Then you had the first class, second class, or whatever. Now you have the fast exit, right? So it's exactly the same seat. It's exactly the same service, but the 3 or 4 first rank of seats, you pay a bit more, and it's called fast exit. You go out. So the economy is turning more and more things. It can turn about anything into make it an economic thing, right? So in Luhmann's term, it means that the system observes its environment and turn it into its own logic. And the economy is doing this. Just a second. The economy is doing this with things, services, ideas, knowledge, but it's also doing it with itself. So it's making economic operation with economic operations. Right? That's finance. Yeah, that's insurance about insurance, risk over risk. Right? So it's observing its environment and it's observing itself over and over again and turning everything into its own code. So it's expanding. It's expanding itself. You can see in passing why Luhmann says a functional system is the product of its own observations. Right? That's what it is. It's product of it produces itself by observing its environment. So, okay, it's very clear with the economy. The point is that all systems do the same. So I think we are wrong to speak about marketization of everything. Marketization, okay, is economy. But if you think about science, science is doing the same. Science, more and more and more problems, things become or can become the object of scientific inquiry. We study more and more and more things. There are more and more disciplines and sub-disciplines. There's more and more knowledge. We have too much. It's impossible. So science also is expanding by observing its environment and turning things into object of study. And of course, just as the economy, it's also observing itself and studying. Science is studying science. Right? That's epistemology, constructivism, that's sociology of science, right? History of science, whatever. Huh? Science is also expanding itself by looking at itself. Expanding.
So there is a hope.
Yeah. Art is doing the same thing. Of course, it used to have in pre-modern art, there was a very limited number of possibilities for art. It has to respect religion and stuff. And then when functional differentiation appeared and released possibilities for art, it started exploring other possibilities. Representing the world, or representing things that don't exist in the world, or representing nothing, a whiteboard. So art is also expanding, producing more and more, and also producing art about art. Yeah.
Is there an interrelatedness between different environments?
Yes, this is complicated, but it's the environment of a given system is made of everything that is not the system, including other systems. Right? So, in the environment of economy, you have individuals because they are outside, and you have the material world, and you have organizations, interactions, and these other functional systems. And so the economy can observe education and make a product of it and sell it, of course. So there are the environment of a system is made of everything that is not the system itself. More on this when reading some of Luhmann. Sorry, you had a question.
Yeah, I think you already answered more or less, but my question was that, so we could say that modern society is also a hierarchical structure according to the capacity of expansion of the different functional systems, or we are like assuming that just expansion is...
No, yeah. For Luhmann, there is no. This is maybe also a shocking idea, but again, work with it before rejecting it. But for Luhmann, there is no hierarchy between functional systems. They are just different ways of coding the world and observing it. Right? They are just. The idea is the idea of difference. Now, it's a difficult. I know it's a difficult one. It's a very difficult one. And you can easily get stuck and say, no, he's wrong. But he's got a trick. There is something. It's also by reading Luhmann that you get to understand this. Of course, some systems go global faster. And the economy has got a very, very fluid medium, money, that makes it really, and that's why we always think of globalization as the economy, the globalization of economy. But it's because it was maybe much more visible, faster, it happened earlier. But there are globalizations of other problems or systems.
Is Luhmann a philosopher or a sociologist?
He's a sociologist. I mean, he would never, ever, he would kill you. No, he thinks of himself as a sociologist. That there is no doubt about it. It's very theoretical, and at the same time, it's all based on empirical observations.
That's his method of investigation.
But I think the distinction between theory and empiry is wrong. We think that there are theories without empirical observation, but I mean, everything that I've been telling you is about empirical stuff. It's about what happened then, it's about history, it's about the economy doing this, doing that. So it's about empirical observations, right? There is no theory in the sky, right?
So he makes those investigations. He makes those directly.
But what does it mean to make an investigation? I mean, isn't it possible that you make an investigation by observing what's happening in this room? Or by observing what's happening in your life? Well, should we say that we investigate only when we are doing a questionnaire or, most of the knowledge that we have about education and society, we don't have it from our so-called empirical investigation. Most of the knowledge that we have, most of the empirical observation that we have, we've got them from living in the world, right? So that's where Luhmann's got his own empirical. What he did is mostly analysis of archives, historical analysis, and then, making sense of his observations of the world. It's true that you could not say this is a guy who did a lot of empirical studies. No. When he started, there is a story when he started at Bielefeld, when he was hired, he was asked, okay, what are you going to do? And he said, I'm going to construct a theory of society. And then he said, okay, how long is it going to take? It was night. It's a true story. It was 1967, right? How long is it going to take? And he said 30 years, right? And he published, the last book is, he published, I don't know, more than 400 papers and I don't know how many books. But the last book is 1997, Theory of Society. And then the third question was, how much is it going to cost? And he said nothing. To answer your question about inquiry, empirical stuff.
He was cheap.
Yeah, it was cheap. Yeah.
No grants.
So, but again, I don't think it's right to call him a philosopher. I don't think, and he rejected that during his whole life. He said, no, this is about sociology. It's about theory, theoretical sociology, but still sociology.
Sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
Do systems, can different systems perform same functions? Or it's like function is specific?
For Luhmann, what defines a system is the function. So, for example, the function of education it's simple. For Luhmann, there is nothing hidden. The function of education is not to reproduce inequalities, even if it does, right? But the function of education, the intention of education is to educate, to have people learn, right? So that also means that what we call the educational system in our everyday meaning of the world, of the word, is not necessarily the same as the education system in terms of theory. Because in terms of theory, the education system of society, that's how he calls it, is made of all the communication whose intention is to have someone learn something. So this is not happening only in schools, right? But the intention is to have an organized, planned intention to have someone learn something. So it's not about me telling you how to go back to the hotel, but it's got to be an organized intention to have someone learn something. Okay. Okay. I was talking about the expansions of system, and I said a word about the economy, about art, about science, and of course, education is also expanding itself. There are more and more and more things that we can learn. More and more subjects, more and more topics, right? Education is observing its environment and turning problems or turning external fact into subject of education. Radicalization, the problem of radicalization very recently has been picked up by the educational system, actually an European education policy, as a problem that should become an educational problem, a problem for education. Education should do something with it, should come up with a program, with a learning or educational program that deal with this problem. To become an entrepreneur, you will read some of the document before, or during the task that you have after. Entrepreneurship has been turned into something that can be learned. That's also part of the expansion of education. The expansion of education is not simply in terms of problems, it's also temporal. It's lifelong learning all the time. So that's a temporal expansion. It's also an expansion, I think, about the educational discourse now is about, well, you can Anyone should learn all the time, and thanks to anyone. So it's not just pupils and teachers. Right? It's trying to expand beyond these categories of pupils and teachers.
Education is everywhere.
Yeah, and of course, and the notion of, and the switch from teaching to learning is an incredible semantic shift that makes it possible for education to expand everywhere, right? Of course, there was also mass education and a social expansion of education, including more and more people. So systems are expanding in different ways, including by looking at themselves, right? Education also looks at education and tries to understand how to educate, how to learn, right? Art about art, make money with money, make economic operation with economic operation, make educational operation about educational operation. Expansions of system. Very often I think we point towards this and we say, sometimes we say marketization or we say neoliberalism. Right? It's maybe a very personal thing, but for me, neoliberalism means nothing. For me, it's a shortcut that makes it possible not to do the analysis of what's happening. So I don't use neoliberalism as a concept. I can see that it's being used by society to observe and define itself. But I would rather use Luhmann's notion of self-referentiality. System becomes self-referential increasingly, and that simply means that they observe the environment and themselves with a specific code. Money, learning, art, whatever. I prefer the notion of self-referentiality instead of neoliberalism. But that's a personal thing. In terms of, because concepts have to be clear, right? And for me, neoliberalism is ambiguous but maybe I'm wrong, but for me, neoliberalism is ambiguous because somehow it's associated with, I think, it's associated with the notion of market and economy, right? And so I'd rather take a more neutral terms, which is self-referentiality and expansion of systems.
So the notion of a contradiction is completely outside Hume's idea of self-referencing, self-correcting, and so forth. The essence of Marxism about contradiction is the contradiction that moves things and changes things.
Mm-hmm.
It's not necessary.
No, it is. I think this is what's happening with system expand through contradiction, that is by including what was excluded. If you take the European project, European educational project, right? Erasmus+, etc. So they are funding, that's Europe acting as almost as a state and funding education, some sort of education, right? But this education, when you look at these projects, what they are, there are no teachers, there are no pupils, there is no curriculum. They are just people gathering around a problem and maybe a risk for the future and trying to deal with this risk. There's no curriculum, there is not necessarily a teacher, and there are not necessarily pupils, and there is no evaluation. So this is maybe not in the sense that you meant by Marx, but this is contradictory towards what we understand as education. And this is by including what was not included and making it also education that the system expands. But there is another question I think behind what you're saying is the problem of conflict in system theory. which I will be happy to discuss someday. It's a difficult one, but again, there is room for conflicts in Luhmann, I think. I have to move on. But sorry, you were saying, sorry.
Is there a contradiction in the differentiation system and environment? There is a tension between this, so that's already included.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there are differences there, and there is also the fact that basically a system has no limit. Everything could become observed by any system, including the same things, right? Like we as individuals, we are outside systems, but you are being observed by education, and when you are observed by education, you are made a student. When you are observed by the economy, you are made a consumer. When you are observed by politics, you are made a citizen. So there are different versions of yourself, for which the expectations towards a student is not the same as the expectations that other systems have towards you when you are a consumer, a citizen, an amateur of art, whatever, a believer in religion. Right? So there are also contradictions in that sense, that it's also a society that it's becoming complicated, but as individuals, as persons, we are excluded from functional differentiation. We are only taken into consideration as a specific, very limited version of who we are. Right? You are taken into account by the education as a learner, and that's how you exist there, right? In the economy, the economy doesn't matter how much you have learned, but how much money you have. That's another version of who you are. Okay. Are you okay? Sorry, huh? I think, you reject or take it, but I am convinced that we have to explore theories like this one or others, but sociological theory. We should not give up the ambition of sociology, or what we call sometimes social theory, theory of society. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
I was just wondering, Parsons' sort of professions is quite central to the creation of systems. So does he reject that then?
No. No, the individual, there are many things in your questions. The individual as a person, so that me, in all that makes who I am, right? Makes me who I am, all the dimensions of myself, when you try to take them together, there is no place for them in functional differentiation, right? I can only take part in a functional system with a specific version of myself. Right? That's one thing. So that's one thing. You were talking about professions. So yeah, Luhmann also worked with professions, and very often, not all the time, but very often, at least during a certain period of time, there is a specific profession or a number of professions linked to a given system, right? Doctors, teachers, whatever. And then, Luhmann studied with Parsons for a couple of years, but broke away theoretically and conceptually quite strongly. I think it's a mistake to make a affiliation. There is more of a rupture between Parsons and Luhmann, but this is also a very complex discussion. So, the switch from pre-modernity to modernity, the golden age of the nation-state encapsulating system, and then system going global, geographically, and expanding themselves thematically, temporally, socially, thematically, etc. Right? Ending up with one global, functionally differentiated society. So this is a very rough, quick, schematic, but